All right, good morning, everyone here in the United States. Good afternoon to our friends and colleagues in Europe, and good evening to our colleagues in Asia. My name is Jackson Ewing. I'm the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Duke University Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. At the Nicholas Institute, we are the secretariat for the project Energy Pathways USA, which is an autonomous regional chapter of the Global Energy Transitions Commission. And our mandate is to work closely with private sector companies, as well as policymakers, civil society actors, academics, others in the decarbonization space to help advance mid-century decarbonization and net zero policies in the US. Today, we're going to be exploring the intersection of the Inflation Reduction Act, of cost increases in the electricity sector, and of the prospective impacts of future EPA greenhouse gas regulations. And we're going to do so primarily through exploring a substantive report that we released late last year at COP28 on this topic. I'll soon hand over the floor to our proper expert on this topic, Martin Ross, senior economist at the Nicholas Institute, lead author of the report, to go through it in detail. But before doing so, I'm happy to offer just a few contextual thoughts. First is that clearly the IRA is a landmark piece of climate and energy transition legislation, as well as a driver of a level of industrial policy and incentive-based structures to drive new economic modes of operation and capture of new strategic parts of the global value chain that is different than the policies that have preceded it, and is pouring a volume of capital into the space never before seen. Initial models had this estimated at just under $370 billion in the 10 years to come, and credible estimates have driven that significantly higher in the time since. And that is, of course, an enormous amount of money, and it's already having influence over the space, which I'll say a word about here in a moment. However, I think we should also contextualize that effort in the other direction and recognize that our stimulus response to the COVID pandemic saw us drive $1.8 trillion towards families and individuals, $1.7 trillion towards businesses. And this is all in one fell swoop, not over the course of a decade. The US economy is roughly $28 trillion right now. So when you consider this level of investment from the IRA as a percentage of those larger expenditures and the larger scale of our economy, it begins to put into stark relief the need for substantial private sector investment. And so this report explores how the IRA is already stimulating such investment and how at that intersection of costs and future regulations, it might do so in the future. There are, of course, some signs of early success with the IRA. In the first year of its operation, we saw roughly a 37% increase in investment in the clean energy space over the year previous, even more substantial gains when you look further back to 4 or 5 years ago. The Biden administration has estimated over $500 billion in committed investment by the private sector, which is already seeing ground broken on new factories, installations, and broader infrastructure in the space. This, of course, though, has not been an altogether smooth rollout, in part because of the changing cost landscape. There have been intersection of supply chain disruptions caused in part by the end years of the pandemic and its continued implications, inflation, and higher interest rates as a result of shifting economic conditions that have little to do at their core and at their source with the clean energy sector, but that certainly have many impacts upon it. And these impacts are disparate across different sources of electricity and different strategies for decarbonization. And we also see uncertainties about future outlooks that result not from these macroeconomic factors, but from potential policy directions. Permitting looms large here. What kind of lead times we'll be looking at for the rollout of the infrastructure that's necessary for a mid-century net zero future. And the modeling that Martin will be going over in a moment addresses that head on. Similarly, what sticks will be put in place in combination with the incentive-laden IRA. And here we look most closely, as I mentioned earlier, at the potential EPA greenhouse gas regulations. Those have a litany of potential effects on decision-making across the electricity sector. Different forces could lead to divergent, plausible scenarios on deployment of CCS, future of hydrogen co-firing, future of natural gas co-firing, and beyond. And this all has major implications for the future of electrification, as well as the emissions footprint of that electrification. The EPA estimates that we could have over a 600 million metric ton reduction in CO2 by 2042 if these regulations are taken up, executed effectively, alongside tens of thousands of tons in reductions in particulate matter with substantial public health and financial benefits as a result. So this work explores these three forces: the IRA, new cost landscapes, and potential future EPA regulations in concert. And it looks at the different interactions among them and presents various scenarios about what is likely to occur as a result. And it has several core findings. I'm going to go through these quickly, but please rest assured that we're going to spend significant time on each of these recommendations in greater detail. So the IRA, under our modeling outcomes, substantially accelerates the decline in U.S. emissions through 2032, even in the face of recent renewable cost increases. After 2032, depending on future of IRA incentives, other policies will be necessary. Recent increases in financing and equipment costs have disproportionately affected the renewable sectors and have dampened the rollout of the renewable transition. This is likely unsurprising to many in our audience here today. However, the modeling finds that these cost increases have not altered fundamental trends, something we'll dive into more deeply. Regardless of inflation, retail electricity prices and household electricity bills are likely to decrease under the IRA, something that's important to keep in mind, obviously, for the distributional justice characteristics of the U.S. energy transition, as well as its political future. And the availability, however, of both sites and permitting for these renewables will have major effects on emissions trends. Reductions in the scope of renewable sites can potentially lead to emissions that are 50% higher in 2032 than otherwise expected under the IRA. This, I think, tracks with some of the other lead modeling that has occurred on the IRA, and our report goes a bit deeper on that issue. We also are working, just as a quick plug, in Energy Pathways USA on recommendations for more effective permitting for the clean energy transition, and we'll be releasing that piece of work later this winter. The IRA can dramatically change the desired investments in renewables for some regions of the country, while other regions might adopt similar strategies irrespective of the IRA. This report attempts to disaggregate our geographical distribution of IRA impacts, as well as some other work which is looking at that in more detail, again, out of the Institute. Natural gas prices matter a lot. If they remain low, gas generation will largely displace nuclear once IRA production credits expire, while also displacing many potential new renewables. When we consider electrification, we also have to think about in use, and there we see that transportation can increase emissions from generation, but total generation emissions would remain at levels well below those today, even before considering emission savings from vehicles themselves. Some regions will require a significant number of miles in new spur transmission lines to connect new renewables to the grid. However, interregional expansion of long-distance transmission may remain limited based on current costs. The EPA greenhouse gas proposal can potentially cut in half the emissions remaining after the conclusion of the IRA. However, the proposal still does not see us reach net zero emissions from generation by 2050. So a disconnect between that outcome and our espoused goals. Under the EPA GHG proposal, the relative prices of natural gas and hydrogen, or costs associated with retrofitting gas units to co-fire with hydrogen, can have large effects on both emissions and costs. Prior to 2038, one of the important years present in the EPA GHG regulations, the majority of emissions reductions from the proposal are the results of coal CCS. That's carbon capture and storage. After 2038, hydrogen markets contribute most of the additional reductions, along with increased renewable generation. And that's assuming that hydrogen is cost competitive with natural gas. So there's a temporal aspect to these changes that the report gets into in much greater detail. And finally, if the clean hydrogen needed under the EPA GHG proposal, which often refers to it as low carbon hydrogen, is provided by electrolysis, then significant amounts of new generation may be required. Solar PV will expand to meet those electrolysis needs, but they may not be able to provide all of the requisite electricity. So you can imagine the ripple effects that could ensue as a result. So I know that I've gone through that fairly quickly and at quite a surface level. As promised, I'll now hand over to Martin Ross to get into all of these issues in much greater detail. Before doing so, however, I do have a request of our audience. I recognize that we are doing this in webinar format, largely for the scale of attendance. However, we would like for this to have more of a meeting and conversational feel than a panel presentation character. So please do not wait. Put your questions or comments in the Q&A function that you'll see on the bottom of your screen whenever you have them. And I will be in your service as the chief interrupter of Martin to put these questions to him as we go along. So we will try to create an atmosphere of dialogue through that Q&A function and have those issues addressed as we work through them, rather than at the end or at any pause. After Martin concludes towards the latter half of our 2 hours, we will hear from senior fellow Tim Profeta at the Nicholas Institute and within the Energy Pathways USA project, who will talk a bit about the regulatory landscape status quo, potential future trends and developments, and the overall implications of some of this work for the future of decarbonization in the US. So with that, I will now hand over the floor to Martin. Please take it away.
All right, thank you, Jackson, and thanks everyone for joining us. Let me pull up slides here. So as Jackson said, going to sort of walk through both the analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act and then potential interactions with the draft greenhouse gas proposal from EPA last May. And this is hopefully somewhat a summary of a more extensive report that you can find online. We're going to try to do a bit of picking and choosing. Hopefully I won't overwhelm things too much. But I do sort of want to give you a sense for, to the extent possible, what is, driving some of the results, in our modeling, and, would be a similar effect in other modeling that you would see out there. So I get a bit specific on, which I think are the most important features to sort of keep an eye on, and what's really driving the results, and where we might want to investigate things more in the future. So I will talk a bit about the model and some of the important assumptions, then go through the IRA in the context of cost increases that we got estimates for over this last summer, and then move into the greenhouse gas proposal, and, some of the things that may sway the behavior, of units, in that type of setting. And then we can, come back, as Jackson said, to any discussion that we haven't sort of followed up, as we went along. So I think there are several, important things to sort of keep in mind as you're looking through these results, starting with the big one of, given that the Inflation Reduction Act was looking at, investment tax credits, for some types of units on the order of, a 30% tax credit. And, we're potentially looking at, cost increases over the last few years that are of a comparable scale. Where does that leave the situation at the moment, given some of these recent cost increases? And then, as Jackson said, take a look at, what do we really need to do, on the renewable side? As Jackson said, we're looking more at, what needs to be done there in the future. But this report, sort of from a analysis standpoint, looks at what happens, depending on the availability of renewable sites. And, take a look at that. Take a look at how the emissions change as a result of the greenhouse gas proposal. And a couple of the big things there to keep in mind are, really what is the difference between the price of natural gas and the price of hydrogen? I'm not, sort of directly modeling the hydrogen markets. For this, it seemed cleanest to basically take a look at some bounding cases. Is the price of hydrogen more or less than the price of gas, delivered to a utility? And then we can take a look a bit at, where it comes from and how you go about that. But so, like, in terms of the recent Treasury guidance, this would fit in the sense that, really what matters is, do the credits that you get depending on the CO2 intensity of the hydrogen, across that range of options that Treasury put out, how do those, the cost of producing hydrogen plus the credits you get under the different options compare to the price of natural gas? And then, how much hydrogen is needed and how do you get it? And finally, try to talk a bit about how gas units may alter their behavior because of the greenhouse gas proposal. They have options to, either burn hydrogen or to sort of adjust their behavior depending on the size of the unit and how much they are running, to either, to potentially avoid some of the criteria in that draft proposal. So talk about that.
Martin, let me jump in here for a moment.
Sure.
We have a question from Paige Gravely, and I think that it's largely a function of my inadequate introduction. When I failed to say, when I described electricity cost reduction, that those were inflation adjusted reductions in electricity costs. But Paige's question is, why will electricity costs go lower under the IRA when numerous reports in various utility regions indicate price increases as utilities continue to upgrade generation and transmission infrastructure?
Well, I think partly that depends on what you're measuring it against. Normally in these in these types of analyses, if nothing else, keep in mind that, when people are presenting, sort of the cost or price impacts of these policies, what they're doing is comparing those price impacts to a world in which the Inflation Reduction Act did not exist. Not to today's prices. So it's both possible that the Inflation Reduction Act could reduce future electricity prices, but that they could still be higher than they are today. So a couple of different things going on there. I don't know if that covers the question. We can cover it a bit more as we go through the talk, I think.
Thanks, Martin. And Paige, please just follow up in the Q&A if you want to add anything to that question or add to it, and we'll continue the dialogue as we go along. Please, Martin.
I think, yeah, Alexa, yeah, it could be a number of things going on in terms of how you see other estimates, but I would start by thinking about exactly how they are presenting those estimates, and then you can sort of go from there in terms of interpreting things. The model that we're using for this, if you're not familiar, is, I mean, it's a fairly standard, long-term capacity planning model of the wholesale markets. So it's looking over the next, 25, 30 years or more at how units respond to different policies and incentives. So it's similar to what I was just saying about the electricity prices. What it normally does is, you would develop a forecast of how the industry responds without a policy like the Inflation Reduction Act, and then you would put in the tax credits related to that act and rerun the model, and then sort of compare those two outcomes, without versus with the IRA. And that's really what these models are designed to do. They generally are, fairly straightforward linear programming models, which basically means that they're trying to find the most cost-effective way of meeting electricity demand, in different parts of the country, based on, and different seasons, different times of day, based on, fuel prices in parts of the country, what it costs to build new units, how the existing transmission network looks, and how you can sort of move electricity around. And, but, at the end of the day, it's really trying to find the most cost-effective way of providing electricity. So, not too much interpretation needed there. Where you really find the differences across the models are in both the level of detail and in the assumptions and data that they are using. We try to stick with publicly available data, from a variety of sources that are used in other models. So I use quite a bit of data from, the EPA IPM model provides, very nice, input data sets and, summaries of, their sort of cost structure and how they model the existing policies, all that sort of stuff. And I try to stick with that in many cases. I bring in additional information from, other folks like NRail on, details on, renewables and whatnot. A lot of the models tend to rely on NRail for their renewable information. There are differences still in terms of, like which year of the NRail data are the various models using. And I try to use the most up-to-date information that's out there. Well, we typically also use the EIA's annual energy outlook forecasts for new unit costs outside of renewables, and other things like electricity demand growth and sort of wholesale, like coal mine mouth prices or Henry Hub prices. And then I did bring in, which is where we're getting some estimates of the recent cost increases for renewables. Bringing in the, NREL's annual technology baseline from this last summer, 2023 forecast that has their latest assumptions on renewables and storage costs. Bring in a few other things that are needed for both the IRA and particularly the draft greenhouse gas proposal, in terms of, carbon capture costs, ability to get pipelines to coal plants, all that sort of stuff from the EPA modeling. And then the policies in terms of the IRA and the greenhouse gas proposal, not running too much sensitivity on those specific policy formulations in terms of the IRA credits, assuming that everyone is going to do what you need to do to get the labor market bonuses, which means you're looking at around, a $30 investment tax credit, or $25 a megawatt hour, and you've got the effects for nuclear generation. And we'll go through some of the greenhouse gas assumptions later on. I do try to run, for better or worse, a fairly wide range of alternative assumptions in some of these scenarios, and I'll be going through that quickly today, but you may want to go back and take a closer look at the report for any specific details you're interested in. But I like to present information specific to a set of assumptions so that you can sort of tell what is driving a particular result in the model. So I don't normally go with just like a range across, shifting a variety of things all at once. I like to sort of vary things one at a time so you can see, in this type of, modeling, cost efficient world, what is driving your results. So I've got a range of things I'll be taking a look at today, and there's more in the report. Starting with looking at the annual technology baseline from 2022, which has the older forecasts of renewables costs before some of the recent increases were factored into the NREL forecasts. I run a cheap gas scenario, which I was generally basing on some results from the EPA modeling, which implies that natural gas is cheaper than what you might see in my more typical annual energy outlook forecast based assumptions. For the limits on the renewable sites, NREL puts out a reduced case scenario in their annual set of standard scenarios, and that put some additional limits on where renewables can go. So I use that in some cases. I was also curious on the hydrogen side of things on a couple of things. One, what's going to happen to some of the results in the draft greenhouse gas proposal if units face costs associated with burning additional hydrogen, and whether that is because they have to retrofit the unit, or because delivered hydrogen fuel prices are perhaps not as low as might be hoped for, and we'll go over that in a bit. So just a quick data point in terms of what this means, what the NREL data mean for these renewables costs. So basically, as the table shows there, from the previous year, onshore wind went up costs. These are the overnight capital costs in dollars per megawatt hour. They went up about 14% for onshore wind, compared with up to 30% for solar, and 30 or more percent for units that either are batteries by themselves or batteries combined with a solar unit. So that's where you sort of wonder, what does that do to the effectiveness of those IRA tax credits when you're looking at cost increases in the very recent past on that order of magnitude. I should say that the NREL forecasts did not have cost increases for offshore wind, and rather than attempting to come up with an assumption on what was going on in the offshore wind markets, obviously there's a lot going on there now, but rather than try to come up with some estimate of my own of some generic forecast of those offshore wind increases, I just used the NREL data. So if nothing else, keep in mind as you take a look at the results that are going to show probably more offshore wind than you would expect, that likely those cost increases are going to shift you away from that offshore wind.
Hey, Martin, I have a quick question on that.
Mhm.
This comes from the audience, not my own. Is there a reason to think that an inflation-oriented increase is going to be permanent across these decades? How do we view the inflation-oriented price blip, or is it not a blip?
Well, I mean, I couldn't necessarily speak to everything that NRail was using in their assumptions. But yeah, it seems like, I mean, well, I mean, just looking at the data, it seems like they're sort of anticipating that the solar panels really, it is a temporary increase based on, current constraints or, tariffs, all that sort of stuff. Um, but it's an increase that, at least they are anticipating will last through the majority of the Inflation Reduction Act horizon. So whether or not they have a decline beyond that is to some extent less relevant. I mean, at that point, once you get out to 2040 or 2050, you're looking at quite low costs for many of these types of renewables units anyway. So whether or not those cost increases are permanent, they already sort of have trend lines that are anticipating continued improvements in these cost structures. So
Hmm.
the current increases, whether they fade away or not, become less relevant, the farther into the future you go.
Got it.
But
Thank you.
I wouldn't necessarily want to, speak for all of NRail's logic on some of those cost increases.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
Um, yep. Right. So let me move on to fuel prices, just because this is, at least as far as the results you'll see in the draft greenhouse gas rule. These are just so critical, what you are assuming here in terms of both the natural gas prices and then their relationship to delivered hydrogen prices. So I've graphed out a number of things here. Um, so well, if you look sort of the orange-red shaded area with the solid orange line in the middle, that is data that I pulled from EPA's analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act, and where the shaded area, the solid orange line is the sort of average natural gas price across the entire country, across all seasons and times of day. And then the shaded area sort of represents just the regional variation around that national price. So it does not, there is additional variation around these shaded areas in terms of, seasons that is not represented, that sort of expand that as well. And you can sort of see where that's where I'm talking about, uh, that was from their April, I believe, analysis of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that compares with in orange above that, the AEO forecasts sort of pre and post Inflation Reduction Act, where this is uh, again, this is sort of a national delivered price in lighter orange, I guess, for the annual energy outlook from 2023. And then I start with the annual energy outlook forecast for wholesale natural gas prices, the Henry Hub price, but then I use fuel transport costs from the IPM modeling around that wholesale price, and that gives me a somewhat different price trend than the annual energy outlook. But you can see the mine is fairly similar to the national average for the annual energy outlook, and then the gray shaded area there is the regional variation around that national average price, which is $3.5 per million BTU, sort of going forward into the future, compared with $2 in the IPM modeling. And then what matters is for the draft rule, how does that compare with the hydrogen price? Because, if the hydrogen price is below the gas price and you're not, facing any costs associated with sort of switching into hydrogen, then you're obviously going to use hydrogen in these models that are finding the most cost-effective way of generating electricity, compared with if the hydrogen costs are above your natural gas price, then you're not going to burn hydrogen. And so there you can see that if you're looking at hydrogen at 50 cents per kilogram, which is $3.70 per million BTU, then based on my assumptions, that's going to be sort of right in the middle of the range of potential natural gas prices going forward. So some regions would find it beneficial to switch over to hydrogen, and some would try to avoid the rules potentially that would lead them to need to use that hydrogen if it costs more than natural gas in a particular region. And compared with some of the EPA data from the Inflation Reduction Act analysis, you can see that even at 50 cents per kilogram for hydrogen, it sort of remains above many of the natural gas prices you would see in that particular analysis. And obviously, if hydrogen stayed at $1 per kilogram delivered, which is sort of the one of the DOE goals, then it will always be more expensive than natural gas in these particular forecasts, and that would then lead to shifts in behavior that you will not see if hydrogen is a cheaper option. So I should probably, unless there's particular questions, move on into some of the results now. So I'm going to sort of give you all a few bullet points, and then put up just to sort of keep in mind, and then I'll put up a slide of sort of related results that we can talk through. So the first thing I did want to note is that I am showing even in the absence of the Inflation Reduction Act, and with factoring in the recent cost increases for renewables, my modeling is suggesting that emissions would still trend downwards over time, but at a fairly gradual pace, and how that exactly evolved would be quite dependent on fossil fuel prices over time. And in the report, I do some additional comparisons to of my emissions trends to those that you would have seen in other analyses, and try to talk a little bit about what would be driving some of that stuff. I didn't go into that as much in this talk. So the modeling does suggest that even with recent cost increases, the Inflation Reduction Act is likely to substantially accelerate the reductions in emissions through 2032, compared with a world in which the Inflation Reduction Act, either didn't exist or had been repealed. But the emissions in the Inflation Reduction Act are 13% higher on average than they would have been, because of these recent increase in renewables capital costs. The emissions reductions that you would see out of the Inflation Reduction Act do remain fairly dependent on both the natural gas prices and the ability to get your new renewables sited and or permitted. So generally, the cheaper the cheaper that renewables get, the more cost effective they are, the easier it is obviously to compete with natural gas. And that to some extent, that's sort of competing with existing natural gas as opposed to competing with new gas construction. So you see that a lot of the results have quite a bit of renewables construction and not that much new gas construction. But it's a bit more of an open question. That trade-off between gas prices and higher renewables costs in terms of running the existing gas units. Um, so you'll see some of that in the results. As Jackson mentioned earlier, if we use those more limited assumptions from NRAIL in terms of how many sites may be available, you can look at emissions that are 50% higher than they would have been otherwise. So it's certainly an important issue, the ability to get these renewables up and running. And then we'll come in some future slides to talking more about the emissions under the greenhouse gas proposal and what they do. So just a couple of quick trends on what emissions look like without the Inflation Reduction Act, but with the higher renewables costs. So I graphed out a couple of things here. One in bluish is sort of the standard, the baseline emissions based on the standard assumptions in the modeling, and that's where you see rather a downward trend, but it's not as dramatic as you might expect or have expected in the past. And then that does depend on the gas prices. If gas prices remain the cheap gas price, where it's gas remaining around $2 per million BTU, emissions can flatten out relatively quickly without the Inflation Reduction Act in existence. And that is similar to what you would have seen in some of the other modeling. It's a bit lower, but that it depends, almost entirely across the different models on the assumptions of fossil fuel prices, and you can sort of see that in the report. With the investment tax credits, I am suggesting fairly significant declines in emissions once you roll in these tax credits. And these results are fairly comparable with what you would see coming out of the NRAIL model, which makes sense in some ways, given that I'm using their data on renewable costs and renewable availability and costs for connecting renewables to the grid and how much is exactly available where. If you did have those lower renewables costs, this dotted line is where the emissions trends that you would have seen with previous cost estimates of renewable generation. So noticeably lower, but the trend sort of remains the same with or without the recent cost increases. Limits on siting are, in some sense, have a more dramatic impact. Where so this is back to a world in which the cost increases for renewables exist, but you're looking at more limited options to get them on the ground, and that has a fairly dramatic impact on the remaining emissions under the Inflation Reduction Act. Were renewables pretty cheap? I won't talk about this too much, but if renewables were particularly cheap, you would be looking at potentially, and using data from the NREL's more advanced technology scenario there. You could certainly get below, emissions levels where you would be cutting off the Inflation Reduction Act credits. And on the reverse dramatic side, if you're in a world with $2 delivered natural gas going forward, you still get some of the initial decline in emissions reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act, but that tends to disappear over time as once those credits sort of expire, you move back into gas. And particularly, I don't get into too much in these slides, but you also move out of renewables after the IRA credits for particularly the existing renewables or existing nuclear come to an end in 2032. Just as a note, though, you can't compare that yellow cheap gas line to the previous ones terribly well because the gas prices are different between them. Jackson.
Hey, Martin, yeah, can you say a bit more about how you deal with credit expiration in 2032? What assumptions you make there? I know that there is some uncertainty surrounding what the future of those credits will be. How do you grapple with that in the model?
In some cases, well, in the report we ran a couple of different approaches. One where they expired in 2032, and one where they were sort of continued on out beyond that, just to see how far how much of a continued downward trend you would see in emissions, and how much additional renewables and installations you would get in the future if those things continued. We also ran some cases where we extended the renewables credits, but did not extend the nuclear and CCS credits to get a few different compare and contrasts. So yeah, I'm not sure which is the most relevant world for how people are planning in the real world for the future of these credits. Just given that in the past, obviously anytime these types of credits come close to expiring, people they tend to get extended, so people may be planning on those extensions. So that's sort of why we ran some of these more extended credit cases to see how much pressure that takes off the system in the near term to get these renewables in quickly, and also where extensions beyond 2032 leave you in the longer term.
Thanks. Yeah, really clarifying. Appreciate it. And I know that some folks in our audience would have views on how they look at that question of what expiry might look like and how they're making plans based on that. So please educate us to the extent that you're willing to, or ask any related questions. All right, thanks, Martin. I'll get out of the way.
Thanks. Well, let me move into the capacity stuff. Capacity results that sort of lead to those emissions reductions. As we've said, these cost increases do sort of have a disproportionately large impact on renewables, which slows down the transition, but doesn't really change, the basic expected trends. Given if you recall back to some of those cost increases by particular type of unit, you can sort of see in the results where, given that onshore wind was, in the NREL data was, going up by 14% from the previous year, whereas, solar and batteries were more on the 30% range. Using these newer cost estimates does, shift you towards wind even more strongly than you would have been otherwise, and away from solar to some degree, and particularly away from the battery storage in favor of combustion turbines in terms of reliability, provisions. And it's certainly possible that that 14% increase for onshore wind is a bit on the conservative side as well, but that was the main thing we're going for now, and that that's one of the types of issues that I expect we'll be revisiting all of these things as we get new data, and as things shift around in terms of greenhouse gas proposals. We'll be revisiting all of these assumptions and re-evaluating where things are at. You do see, as I'd mentioned, you do need a fair number fewer combined cycle units because of the Inflation Reduction Act, and it is certainly successful in delaying some of the nuclear retirements. You do tend to see the nuclear retirements fairly quickly after the credits expire, but through 2032, there's certainly far fewer nuclear retirements than you would see without the Inflation Reduction Act. The higher battery costs in this forecast, certainly do shift around the desired mix in terms of whether you're thinking of it in terms of just the storage for renewables or for overall provision of reliability on the system. Those higher battery costs are having a fairly dramatic effect potentially. And then once once the Inflation Reduction Act ends, things get less interesting in terms of what's going on in terms of renewables. You see a few continued things, but it becomes less dramatic. So taking a look at some of the annual changes, starting with looking at through 2028 initially, looking at annual capacity additions or retirements by type of unit for the first few years going into the future. So this graph compares the first left-hand bar is expectations without the Inflation Reduction Act, if it were for some reason not there or were repealed, but still in a world where renewables costs are higher than they would have been several years back. So the Inflation Reduction Act, either of those second two bars, whether it's the standard IRA results, which include the cost increases, or the IRA results using the previous annual technology baseline forecasts that were lower, you can see that either one of those, under either one of those worlds, the Inflation Reduction Act does shift you fairly significantly into renewables fairly quickly and out of the natural gas units that you would have constructed in the absence of those credits. And then the degree to which you're building those renewables does depend on the cost of those renewables. If they were cheaper, as they had been in the past, you would have been building more, and that is scaled back somewhat for sort of the standard modeling assumptions, which is the IRA bar there. Then moving into the next couple of years, wind sites, even without the credits, were because of sort of expected cost declines, regardless, they were becoming more competitive over time. So you do see more of those installations with or without the credits. In terms of comparing the two sets of IRA results, the biggest difference really is in that shift out of batteries and into the light gray shaded area there in that IRA line is the new combustion turbines. So you can see that you're still not really putting in new gas combined cycle units in this world of the Inflation Reduction Act. But if battery costs are fairly expensive, as they are in the new assumptions, that you're not getting either the standalone batteries in red up at top or the sort of combined solar plus battery installations that were in the red and yellow hashed mark there under the AEO 2022 line. And then I'd say, a somewhat similar story over the next couple of years. Without the IRA, you would have, built some wind, earlier on, but that tends to tail off fairly quickly without the tax credits for onshore wind. And then you're moving again, still strongly into renewables, as you move forward in time, with the IRA, regardless of any cost increases. And then, after 2032, you can sort of see that you've, in some sense, in the world of the Inflation Reduction Act, you've shifted your renewable installations forward in time to take care of or take advantage of the tax credits. And then, once new units, and I wasn't sort of tailing off, how, you know, you know, you know, how exactly that construction time period played out, but once you're no longer really getting quite the same level of tax credits, you're sort of concentrating on building combustion turbines to support the higher level of renewables in the system. And then a similar story going forward. You would have, without the Inflation Reduction Act, you would have seen, continued smaller declines in, the costs of solar panels, and you would have, you know, seen them continuing to be built a bit, but you've really, front loaded them in the Inflation Reduction Act. And then, after that, things really sort of tail off in terms of differences across the policies. As so, uh, as Jackson mentioned, those national results do hide a fair amount of regional variation that I was interested in getting into a bit more in the report. Um, and you can see where some regions were going to do the same thing regardless of the Inflation Reduction Act potentially, and other regions were really shifting things around in terms of what was built or when it was built as the result of those tax credits. I don't talk about it too much here, but in the report, I also talk about the effects of different gas price assumptions in different regions, and that can have some pretty big impacts as well. But I mean, regardless of what you're assuming on costs, you get a lot of additional renewable generation as the result of the Inflation Reduction Act, and you are building potentially a fair number of new transmission lines to get those renewables on the grid. Um, and yeah, just a note that doesn't really necessarily show up in the graphs, but I did think it's worth mentioning is that just keep in mind also with these types of models, you're getting sort of behind the scenes a lot of the potentially non-generating fossil units that are hanging around to provide reliability for these worlds where you have high levels of renewables in the system. Um, and you do have to at least ponder how long that is likely to happen for, and exactly what's going to happen there. And to the extent that that's not true, you're going to need more storage or batteries or whatever else than you might potentially see in some of your standard modeling results, including these. So this graph takes a look at sort of cumulative capacity changes from 2020 through 2032 for cases, without the Inflation Reduction Act, and then with it, with more limited sites available for renewables. So all of these cases already incorporate, NREL's current estimates of renewable costs, capital costs. So that doesn't vary across these scenarios. I'm not going to say too much about the coasts, in part because the interest action really is as you move into the center of the country. There's a little map down there in the corner. So the Middle Atlantic is sort of you know part of the Reggie type area, the middle coast area. So you do see some differences there, particularly in developing onshore wind as the result of these credits. So without the IRA, you would have been inclined to develop some wind. With the IRA, you develop quite a bit more onshore wind. But if the available onshore wind sites are reduced, that using those NREL data, you could be scaling back fairly significant on the onshore wind installations. And across all of those regions, you can sort of see where I would at least point out that I think you would see a somewhat different story there, obviously, in the offshore wind thing. Offshore wind without any cost increases, tended to be fairly cost effective. And to the extent that that's not necessarily true, in what you're seeing today, that you would get some shifting out of those offshore wind blocks, sort of the hash or the white and green squares up the top there, and that would have to be made up for by something else. As you move into the Carolinas and Florida, you can see more significant impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, and also more significant impacts if you put limits on some of these available wind and solar sites. North Carolina obviously already has quite a bit of solar, and without the tax credits, would be certainly less inclined than some areas to build new solar under that no IRA line. The tax credits do sort of take care of that effect, and you build more solar, and much the similar story in Florida. As you move into the east north central and east south central regions, that's where you start bringing in some of these wind, more of these onshore wind resources, at least as available, potentially available. So without the IRA in both the east north and east south regions, onshore wind development was comparatively limited, particularly compared with what you see under the Inflation Reduction Act scenarios. But you also see if those onshore wind sites are restricted, you can potentially see some of the biggest declines in the country of how much onshore wind is likely to occur if some of those limits are placed on your site development options. The sort of central part of the country, so the west central regions and the plains in Texas, they obviously have a lot of wind resources, sort of no matter what you do, and are already developing wind. But you do see where obviously they're going to develop more wind resources, and keeping in mind again that these are like cumulative changes from 2020 through 2032. So we're looking at fairly large numbers, but you do see fairly significant onshore wind development, even and even more in most regions than you see without the Inflation Reduction Act credits. There you do see a bit of a thing in the plains regions where onshore wind actually declines a bit as a result of the credits, but that's really because of competition with additional competition with wind resources in sort of the surrounding states that are building more wind than they would have otherwise. So the plains are it's really not either necessary to build as much onshore wind in the plains when the surrounding states are building more, and or it's harder to get that wind electricity out to other parts of the country when other states are using those transmission lines. And then just a quick note in terms of the coal with CCS, I was not seeing quite as much coal with CCS as were in some of the other analyses of the Inflation Reduction Act. But I did want to point out that where it is coming in is largely either along the Gulf states or in some of the mountain states where you can use it for enhanced oil recovery. I mean, even though you can look at the data in the report, but even though you get smaller credits for CO2 that's used for enhanced oil recovery, you're still getting the most benefit because of these sort of negative storage costs in particular parts of the country where oil production is ramping up. And then, as I said, really all similar to the East Coast, not that many adjustments on the West Coast where you already had things going on. So it's, they're less affected by, the installations are less affected by, the renewable credits. I'm definitely going to use up the time. I did want to put in a quick note just on, the retail electricity price impacts that we talked about earlier. And these, as we discussed earlier, these graphs are sort of comparing electricity prices to what they would have been in the future without the Inflation Reduction Act. So not compared with today's prices. So when you look at prices in that fashion, you're subsidizing some of these units, that might potentially have been setting the marginal cost of generation in a particular region. So if you're subsidizing renewables, and renewables were the most expensive way of producing electricity in a particular time of day or a particular part of the country, and then you subsidize those renewables, that lowers the marginal cost, and that feeds through into eventually into the retail price of electricity. And also, I should point out, which may or may not, which may also feed into that particular question. It's a bit hard to do these comparisons in this analysis because the gas price is changing. I don't want to page all the way back, but the gas prices, whether you're looking at the annual energy outlook or the EPA IPM modeling, gas prices without the Inflation Reduction Act were, quite a bit higher, well, noticeably higher than they were, once you bring the Inflation Reduction Act in. And I wouldn't necessarily want to, that there's a whole lot of stuff that would be going into those cost estimates in terms of what's potentially happening in the rest of the economy. But that does make this comparison a bit harder in terms of, to the extent that natural gas units are setting the electricity price, you're comparing two cases here with different gas prices. So gas prices are lower, and hence costs and retail electricity prices are lower in these sort of relative Inflation Reduction Act impacts. And I think, Jackson, you're looking like you've got a thought on this.
Well, it's more, Martin, to say that we're about to pivot towards the EPA regulations. So I want to take a pause here to give the audience an opportunity to ask IRA specific questions, which of course we won't be abandoning completely. I have a couple that have come in. I'm going to start with Jeff, who asks, could you briefly describe how discount rate assumptions influence these outputs and what discount rates are used? Thanks.
I was using, I think it was NREL stuff. So in real terms, whether you think of it as a, discount rate or, the real interest rate that feeds into your financing costs, I think it was 4.5, 5%. I didn't really run ranges on that in terms of, like the EPA stuff of, 3% versus 7%. Um, in part because, the NREL data happened to be sort of a mid price case, and it's, a little hard to say exactly where interest rates are going in the future. But these models are sort of trying to minimize costs over time. So the lower the interest rates are, um, you know, uh, the more you're going to sort of shift your behavior around as a result of that. If you were looking at a discount rate of 7%, um, then you're not really. It implies in some sense that you're less worried about the future, and you're going to try to shift your costs more off into the future. And conversely, for higher interest rates or discount rates. So I don't play with that as much, but it's more sort of a middle case between the EPA runs.
Okay, thanks much. And again, clarify similarly as before, when we're talking about real, we mean inflation adjusted. Jeff, please follow up if you'd like to take that forward. Jeff does mention here, utility models often use a fairly high discount rate, a weighted average cost of capital, typically 7% or higher. Jeff comes to us from NCUC, so well placed to speak to this. Martin, any reaction there, or shall we move on?
Yeah, so yeah, well, partly I was just speaking to the sort of the overall real interest rate in the economy, but yeah, once you sort of calculate the like a weighted average working cost of capital, it's uh I don't remember the exact details, but yeah, certainly I don't think 7 or 8% would be unusual, or I think that would be what comparable to what's underlying these runs. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. I've certainly seen higher as well. We've done other runs. I still am running some adjustments in the North Carolina region in particular to use cost of capital assumptions that are specific to North Carolina from some previous work that we had done. So it's a bit higher in the North Carolina region in particular.
Thanks much. I have another question from audience that concerns your comment earlier about 70% of the kind of backup generation capacity to deal with episodic renewables coming from fossil. And
Mhm.
do you what needs to be explored, perhaps not necessarily in the work that's being presented here, but looking forward on different scenarios there for expanded storage and how that might impact that figure of kind of a high level of fossil fuel backstopping operating on low utilization rates?
Mm. Yeah, well, yeah, I mean that certainly gets into what I find some of the, the interesting modeling stuff. I didn't really talk about it, but what we do to address that as much as possible in these sort of long run models is to pull the results out for a particular year in terms of the capacity that's available in the system, and then run it through an hourly version of the model to see if you're looking at particular shortfalls in any hours of the year, and then if the long-term results are not sort of consistent with meeting the types of reliability constraints that are in these the long-term versions of the model in terms of whether it's the peaking reserves or the it's operating flexibility reserves. You can make some adjustments in terms of the number of batteries or the number of turbines that you need in the system just to meet those basic reliability constraints. But I do agree. I think that more needs to be done to you know do some runs. I mean, there's a number of runs that you really need to do to explore that. Starting with not the easier ones, but looking at things like when you do that type of hourly analysis, you're sort of looking at a specific, aside from anything else, you're looking at a specific weather pattern. You're looking at a specific, sort of hourly demand pattern for electricity, and both of those can change in the future and give you, different reliability results than you thought you had. So that's one thing that we've looked at in the past. It does get sort of time intensive to run all those possible scenarios, but I think people do, and I just wanted to point out, if nothing else, with that comment, that I think people do need to evaluate and do more in these long run models to um, you know think about whether or not it's realistic to have some of these coal units or gas units sitting around for significant periods of time in the future, just for the sake of providing these reliability services when they're never actually, potentially, either running or, allowed to run because of some policy definition. And you could go into the modeling scenarios and sort of, prevent them from hanging around. Um, and that would be sort of the simplest way of getting around that is to just say that if they're not running after a number of years, then you've got to fully retire them. At the moment, the models retire, and not just my modeling, but models would retire them based on whether or not the payments they're getting for providing capacity are enough to offset the fixed operating costs of sitting there in the system. And those fixed operating costs do, in the data sort of increase over time, but may not sort of really capture, some of the real world concerns of having these units just sitting there. So
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
work to be done, but just wanted to point it out.
Oh, those are great points. And I think that's a pretty good segue into where we're going next on EPA regulations about the future of those fossil combustion systems. So I'll hand over back to you, Martin, to carry on. One note, folks likely saw a random yes come through our collective chat. This is a technical snafu. We got the question to the panelists of whether these slides would be shared. And I answered to everyone, yes. That likely made no sense. So clarifying here, we will share the slides after the session. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, that sounds good. It certainly does not cover everything in the report, but if you're looking for a quick summary, I'm not going to, moving into the greenhouse gas proposal, though, I'm not going to really talk about the criteria too much, other than to say that these were the criteria that were included in the modeling. So it covered both the existing and new units, and you had each unit in the model has a choice of how it's going to respond to the regulations. Highlights. So I'm going to go through a bunch of highlights, and then I would like to have time to sort of walk through some of the details in terms of a few of the more interesting points in the results. And I may have to move relatively quickly to do that at this point, but so I was seeing that the draft proposal still in my modeling has potential to significantly reduce emissions. Even if you don't get the net zero, I was seeing more emissions reductions than you would have seen like in the May, June EPA regulatory impact analysis, where there were fairly limited installations of new renewables in that analysis. I was certainly seeing more emissions reductions, but that does vary quite a bit depending on what you feel about the future of gas prices and hydrogen prices and renewables. In the standard set of scenarios, I was, as Jackson mentioned way back in the beginning, I'm seeing coal plants retrofitting with CCS. That's one of the response options for units that are sort of intending to stick around for the foreseeable future. I was seeing a fair number of gigawatts of coal retrofitting with CCS compared with what I was seeing just under the Inflation Reduction Act. And those retrofits were, providing fairly significant contributions to the emissions reductions in the near term from the draft proposal. I mean, so these are emissions reductions on top of the Inflation Reduction Act. Quite a few of those, half or more than half, I forget exactly which, coming from the installation of carbon capture on these longer lived coal units. And then after you get beyond that, then it's a question of the hydrogen markets and how many reductions they are providing. So that does increase the amount of CO2 storage you're getting or needing on an annual basis from a fairly small 25 million tons of CO2 up to more than 200 million tons. But even at those levels, most of that CO2 is still being in regions and being used for locations where there's an enhanced oil recovery going on. Although I would note, that this is just an analysis of the the draft greenhouse gas proposal at this point. So it is not including any future potential competition for those that enhanced oil recovery needs from other sectors of the economy. So it's not like the cement industry is trying to ship CO2 down to the oil wells and compete with the electric utilities in these results. Anyway, on our renewables front, we are seeing more onshore wind, up to 30 gigawatts additional because of the draft proposal, which is a bit different than at least in the EPA analysis. All depending on the assumptions you make, of course. And we'll go through my general thoughts on what are sort of the most important criteria to look at, and that really does get into renewables and hydrogen markets as opposed to the specific these specific cutoff levels for the criteria for which types of units are being affected and at what utilization rates you're looking at defining the policy over. And then electricity prices, they're not going down in these scenarios in most cases, but the price impacts are still comparatively small. So I put this table in the report, sort of giving a first off a general sense of what are the features of the analysis that are or the future trends in the markets that are going to have the most effect on what the draft greenhouse gas proposal as it was defined last summer, what is going to influence the emissions coming out of the policy the most, and just sort of breaking it down by category, and whether it's the size of the unit or the utilization rate. Those are comparatively small impacts on overall emissions if you vary that from a 300 megawatt gas plant down to an existing combined cycle unit of just 100 megawatts, or if it's running at 50% of the time versus 40% of the time. Fairly small impacts on emissions, to the point where I didn't even really try to graph it in this graph because it you lose the impacts on the scale. And then if you take a look at the the cost of renewables or the availability of renewables, that certainly has a more noticeable, more significant impact on emissions. And then you really start getting into big impacts depending on those last three criteria in terms of what's the price of gas versus hydrogen. Also, are you having to do stuff to your gas unit in order to burn the hydrogen? And then, how is that hydrogen produced? Is it from outside of the electricity industry, or is it being produced through electrolysis, presumably by renewables that, were they not producing hydrogen, those renewables could have been used potentially to provide electricity to the grid itself. So this was just the main sort of standard IRA results from previously for comparison, and then this was the trend for the EPA greenhouse gas draft proposal, and and that's where I was seeing more significant impacts than was in the EPA analysis. Then if you start moving into what happens if you didn't have those renewables available, that's the green line here, where if your renewable onshore wind sites in particular, if those are sort of scaled back by 50%, then you are looking at potentially significantly higher emissions, and compared with a world in which renewables are really quite significantly low cost using NREL data. You get even more emissions reductions, not surprisingly. What happens to the greenhouse gas proposal emissions if you live in a world where natural gas remains at around $2 per million BTU, and that sort of moves you back out of this world in which you get major action because of the draft proposal. If this cheap gas scenario where gas is on average nationwide staying around $2 per million BTU, that means that gas is cheaper than hydrogen no matter what. And rather than burn hydrogen to meet some of those proposal criteria for the gas units, you're just going to sort of shift around the behavior of which units are running and how much they're running in order to avoid burning that hydrogen that costs more than natural gas. A bit different world for you get a bit of a different result for if hydrogen stays at $7 per million BTU. Well, let me skip on. We'll get back to that stuff in a second. So I put these results in terms of a cost per ton metric versus the cumulative reductions you get out of them. A bit of a complicated graph, but it does get quite a bit of information across in a simple setting. So up the left-hand side of the graph, you've got your cost per ton reduced, sort of a present value through 2050 of all the emissions reductions that you get out of the draft greenhouse gas proposal. And then on the bottom of the graph, that's overall percentage reduction, again as a cumulative measure compared with the Inflation Reduction Act emissions. So you're looking at sort of as was initially defined, where existing combined cycle units above 300 megawatts running above 50% were affected. You're looking at a an implied cost per ton reduced for CO2 of around $7 per ton, and you're getting a significant emissions reduction at that point of cumulatively 42% lower emissions through 2050. And then you can see as you sort of vary that criteria, whether it's a 300 megawatt combined cycle unit that now has a cutoff of 40% instead of 50%, or if you're scaling it back to affecting 100 megawatt units, combined cycle units, you're certainly talking differences in terms of cost per ton, and small differences in terms of cumulative emissions reductions. But as you'll see on the next graph, I mean, in some sense, in relative terms, these are big cost differences, but you're still looking at pretty low costs in terms of dollars per ton, compared with what you see when you start bringing in some of these other sensitivities to the mix. So these were the data points from that previous slide where you've got a carbon cost, implied carbon cost of like $7 to $12 per ton, and you're getting fairly significant emissions reductions compared with the Inflation Reduction Act, regardless of exactly how you go about defining the criteria for the existing combined cycle in the draft proposal. But then if you're looking at a world with cheap gas, again, that's a world where gas is basically almost always cheaper than hydrogen, even if hydrogen is 50 cents per kilogram. That obviously has I had to change the scale of the axes on the graph to bring in some of these data points. You're looking at $25. I mean, in some sense, that's still below the social cost of carbon, but it's a cost per ton reduced that is significantly different than what you were seeing in a world where hydrogen might be more cost competitive with natural gas. And there's a variety of reasons for that in terms of, you're doing more to sort of shift the generating behavior of the existing gas units in order to avoid using hydrogen, and that raises the costs of complying with the draft proposal. I don't want to say too much about the reduced renewables, just partly for time, but in this world, you've already, this is compared with a world in which, you already had sort of limited your renewable availability in terms of meeting the Inflation Reduction Act. So bringing in the draft greenhouse gas proposal in a relative sense doesn't really alter the results too much in that sense, whether it's just that little triangle there for a reduced renewables data point, or if it's a reduced renewables in the world of cheap gas. And again, somewhat similarly, if renewables in general are, have low capital costs in both an Inflation Reduction Act world and then the world where you layer on the draft proposal, in terms of total emissions reductions, you're looking at some big differences, but in terms of cost per ton measure, compared with the Inflation Reduction Act world, it's less dramatic there. These last couple of data points, though, where you're looking at higher hydrogen costs, you see a somewhat similar story to a world in which gas is cheap, in part because it's, in some sense, a similar world. If hydrogen is more expensive than gas, it doesn't really matter in the context of a cost-efficient solution. Is it more expensive because gas is cheap, or is hydrogen more expensive than natural gas because the hydrogen itself is expensive? So whether or not gas is $2 and hydrogen is $3.70, as in the cheap gas square there, or in these other dots where hydrogen may be $1 per kilogram or $7 per million BTU, and natural gas is $4 per million BTU. Has sort of the same directional impact on the results, where the cost per ton reduced that you see goes up significantly, and the amount of emissions reductions decline. So a quick look at capacity changes in this type of setting. So as I mentioned, you get coal plants retrofitting with CCS to avoid retiring in 2030. If they were units, presumably, generally the larger, more efficient units that were intending to stick around beyond 2040, you do get a decent number of those, 30 gigawatts worth retrofitting, which is more than you saw just based on the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not really seeing gas with CCS as particularly cost effective across most of the modeling. And as we mentioned, you do get more onshore wind as a result of the draft proposal than you did with the IRA by itself, which already had quite a bit of onshore wind. Um, and you do, again, sort of concentrate those renewables in the middle sections of the country rather than on the coasts. And you also, somewhat as a side effect, you concentrate where you're also building new combustion turbines to sort of support those renewables in the middle of the country. And I don't talk about it too much just for time in these particular graphs, but you can see in the report where if you are producing hydrogen through electrolysis, you do need, a appreciable amount of additional new capacity in order to provide that hydrogen. Jackson?
Yeah, Martin, thanks. I recognize you're keeping a close eye on time. Let's try to wrap this over the next 12 minutes or so before ceding the floor to Tim. So for our participants, please do get your questions or comments in over that period, and we'll make sure that Martin has a chance to respond to them. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I totally forgot I got to leave Tim time as well. Thank you, Jackson. Let me skip over these regional capacity changes. Since they're in the paper, they're not like wildly dramatic, but the main story being that new renewables, as a result of the draft proposal, are again sort of concentrated in the middle section of the country, as you saw for the basic Inflation Reduction Act results. I did want to say something about both hydrogen, quickly, hydrogen and the behavior of the existing gas units. And again, just to sort of broadly note that, you're looking at, the relative price of gas versus hydrogen has, one of the biggest impacts on the results that you're going to see. So, you really need to, take a look at worlds in which, either of those prices can be higher than the others. And I was suggesting, if hydrogen in my main scenarios, hydrogen, at $3.70 per billion BTU and or 50 cents per kilogram is potentially cheaper than natural gas in some regions and in some times of the year. And you can be looking at 2.5 quadrillion BTU of hydrogen consumption by 2038, which is significant. I mean, no matter how you look at it. I don't even remember exactly how much natural gas consumption there is in generation in the most recent years, but if you're looking at 7, 8, 10 quadrillion BTU of natural gas being used in electricity in the recent past, gives you a sense for the scale of what 2.5 quadrillion BTU of hydrogen consumption would mean for the industry. Altering the criteria of the gas units, or the size of the gas units, or the utilization rates of the units that are affected, still really only has small effects on the amount of hydrogen demand compared with all the other things that could be going on. If you're looking at gas units having to pay to retrofit to burn hydrogen, they really seem resistant to doing that. You'd rather sort of alter the behavior of the units, to avoid the either the size criteria or the 50% utilization rate criteria rather than have to pay, I was using a 20% capital cost increase in order to burn hydrogen for those particular runs. Reducing the availability of renewables also can have a big effect because you really need those renewables either to avoid burning gas or potentially to provide the hydrogen through electrolysis. Jackson?
Yeah, I want to jump in on that point. I mean, that seems, and we have a related question to this. That seems like a difficult, potentially vicious cycle. If we're reducing the availability of renewables through siting restrictions, that drives up the need for hydrogen. Would that not also compound the challenge of producing that hydrogen through electrolysis for the same source reasons?
Yes, definitely. I do have I dropped it out of the next graph, unfortunately, to try to simplify things a tad, but I do have graphs um, in the paper with the hydrogen demand. If you're producing, I guess you can see some of that here. Over on the left-hand side, you've got a few different variations of just changing, if it's, a 300 megawatt combined cycle unit running at 50% versus 40% versus a 100 megawatt unit that's being, affected by the draft criteria, that has fairly small impacts on the amount of hydrogen you need moving over. And then this would be a question sort of compared to that reduced renewables graph where you're looking at, instead of, you know, 2.5 quads of hydrogen in 2038, you're looking at, 3.5 quadrillion BTU of hydrogen in 2038 in a world where you have fewer renewables around and hence you need to burn more natural gas because those renewables aren't available. So it's certainly a big impact. And then if you move way over to the right-hand side of that graph and take a look at, if you're producing those renewables from electrolysis, then, and those, and that sort of, if that is pulling renewables out of supplying the grid because it's being used to produce hydrogen, for the natural gas plants, you're sort of compounding those impacts.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I have two more questions from our audience, one specific and one fairly general. The specific one's from our colleague at Wake Forest, Hussein, who asks if there's a significant effect of transportation electrification on these cost calculations that you make.
Yes, there is. There's some runs in the report on that where I pulled a few different studies, their forecasts of transportation electrification and took a look at how much additional capacity you would need and what that would do to the system. I didn't try to squeeze any of that, unfortunately, into this analysis, but there is some stuff in the main report on that. And that is one of our sort of next steps is to spend more time on that and more time on these hydrogen markets, I think, both of which are sort of critically important things.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. And I think we'll have the bandwidth to get into some of those things in EPSA moving forward. A more general question here is about how regulated entities are going to meet their commitments under these prospective EPA regulations. How much are we assuming that they're going to follow technologies specifically listed and detailed in the EPA regulations themselves, or how much conversely would they be able to find environmentally equivalent means of meeting the standards of performance?
Well, in terms of the analysis, the models all are finding the cost-effective way of doing it. So I mean the models will always be giving units options of like a coal plant if it wants to retire rather than put on CCS, that sort of thing will always be an option in these analyses. This analysis and other analyses wouldn't be sort of going farther afield in terms of defining the policy itself more broadly in terms of, if it's like, depending on how broadly you want to define it, we wouldn't be looking at, are there, like more cost-effective ways of offsetting these emissions through planting trees or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, Probably you'd have a hard time both, finding that type of analysis and doing it because it, that usually leads to a sort of a broader policy definition and or a world where you're aiming towards a bigger policy goal like a net zero by 2050 across the entire economy.
Yeah.
So within the constraints of the electricity system and what the units can choose to do, they have options. Outside of the policy definitions, most of the analyses would not be expanding that far. But it's somewhat relevant, this next stuff, I think, in terms of,
Mhm.
if I can do this in 2 or 3 minutes here, in terms of how the gas units are responding to the policy. It's not maybe quite that question, but it is related to it. Um, I don't know if I want to go through all these bullet points, but the graph, let me walk through the graph and then we can sort of talk about, it covers a lot of these bullet points that, folks haven't had a chance to memorize all of those yet. Um, so what I attempted to do in this part of the report was sort of graph out, this is way towards the end. So if you haven't made it towards the end of the report, you would miss this. But at the end, there is taking a look at how the gas generation shifts in response to the draft greenhouse gas proposal under a variety of different conditions. Because we were curious, what happens, to units. So on the bottom of the graph, you can sort of see it breaks it into existing combined cycle units versus new combined cycle units. And then, are they bigger than 300 megawatts or, smaller than, or are they between 100 megawatts and 300 megawatts? And that was sort of looking at just focusing on the combined cycle, the combustion turbines, the behavior wasn't changing enough to affect like total emissions results. So focusing on the combined cycle units, are they burning natural gas or hydrogen, and how much are they sort of changing their behavior as a result of different ways of either defining the greenhouse gas proposal or the world that you're facing in terms of hydrogen costs, amongst other things. So this is how these different types of units across the entire country, how much electricity they were generating from natural gas versus hydrogen. Hydrogen in this world under the Inflation Reduction Act was always more expensive than natural gas. So, none of the units were burning hydrogen, but you can see that on the left-hand side of the graph, units between 100 megawatts and 300 megawatts were generating, 119 terawatt hours of electricity under the Inflation Reduction Act, and then, 205, for the larger units, and then new units. And this was in 2032, I believe. And then new units were generating, a somewhat comparable amount in terms of 178 terawatt hours of electricity. Then when you bring in the draft proposal defined as affecting units above 300 megawatts and running at more than 50% of the year, you can see over on the very left-hand side that you're still generating as much from the smaller combined cycle units using natural gas as you were before. So 103 terawatt hours from natural gas from those units compared with the 119 that you would have done, under the Inflation Reduction Act. But because hydrogen in this particular run is relatively cheap compared to natural gas, you're also, you're sort of doubling total generation from those smaller units. And, half of that is coming from natural gas, the 103 versus another half, the 109 terawatt hours coming from hydrogen use at these smaller units.
Thanks,
And then you
Martin.
can see,
I recognize this is the last slide, so kudos for being on
oh,
time. I do want to make
have
sure that we
to,
give Tim a few minutes, and we are going to have a hard
sorry.
stop at 11 for the event. So if you could please wrap up in the next minute or so, appreciate it.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, let me skip through some of these criteria. And like I said, I'm sorry about this. The graph is in the report, and I had hoped to go through some of the interesting stuff, in part which included how behavior shifts when you cover smaller units, and are they burning gas versus hydrogen. If you're facing retrofit costs, then no one wants to burn hydrogen. If you're facing cheap gas, then you're sort of totally off the scale, and you're burning a lot of gas and no hydrogen, but you're doing that by much more extreme shifts in which units are running and how much they're running to try to avoid the comparatively expensive hydrogen.
Yeah.
And I'll just skip through that and call it good.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
My apologies.
No, not at all. Thanks much, Martin. I know that it was quite an effort to get through all of that detail in a relatively short amount of time, and also recognize this is a lot to ask our participants to digest. So we will certainly be sharing the slides, and there's a lot more coverage of these issues that you can take in your own time and speed through the report itself. I think where Martin ended is a good segue into hearing from Tim about the future outlook of some of the regulatory landscape here, particularly as it relates to the future of gas. And Tim is particularly well placed to weigh in here, given that he's recently returned to the Nicholas Institute from the EPA. And we're not asking Tim to summarize, which in this case would be impossible, but to rather just leave us with a few thoughts on the implications of this work moving forward. Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks, Jackson, and thanks, Martin, for a tremendously thorough analysis and the presentation of the analysis. Yeah, it's kind of daunting to think of like 5 minutes to sort of cover some of the key threads, but let me just sort of talk about, first I want to just kind of recognize a couple of key sort of variables we heard from Martin's work. First, I think, and we've joked about this within the Institute, you can't talk about the IRA's execution without talking about the need for transmission siting of renewable generation as a sort of a key potential frustration point for satisfying the goals. I mean, Martin's work, sort of brings it home. 50% of reductions in the IRA are sort of subject to some assumptions of siting and transmission, and then that actually accelerates more when you look at the greenhouse gas regulations execution. So, key question going forward is going to be, whether that's feasible, what policy interventions that I know are being talked about frequently around town would be key for that. I also sort of want to acknowledge that the tax credits and the other provisions of the IRA are all under current execution. So even if we stay in the land of just the IRS execution, there's a lot of major factors that people are looking at in terms of how those tax credits are executed. Clearly, with the importance of hydrogen and hydrogen firing in some of these scenarios, the hydrogen prices as it being a massive variable in Martin's analysis. The conversations about the execution of the hydrogen tax credit are central to the brain. I wouldn't ignore the 45Q guidance that will need to come out, and making sure that the 45Q guidance for the CCS projects that we see as part of this future are also relevant. And then I think one of the most relevant things here is what do we really foresee in terms of the clean energy tax credits in particular, and tax credits in general expanding past 2032. That the clean energy one, of course, has language in the IRA that talks about extending past that 2032 figure if it doesn't hit certain emission targets. Are we, what happens if we assume that keeps going in onward past the 2032? Does that have some implications, and how those are executed? Looking towards the EPA regulations, and what the implications for the EPA regulations. I think we see quite variability exactly how you deal with different parts of the fleet, and the effect. I don't know if we really got into this, but the effect of different capacity factor limitations for different categories. I think it's important actually to say at the outset, I think in one of Martin's earlier slides, initial slides, was that the EPA regulations are not projected to get us to net neutral by 2050. And I would just say to that, nor should they, because that's not the authority on which EPA regulations are grounded. They're grounded in sort of a technology assessment of what is feasible to reduce a pollutant from a certain category of source. They certainly, though, do try and capture the technology that's in the market to put the sector on a trajectory to reach greenhouse gas reduction targets. And it should be recognized also, they are by definition updated as technology develops. I think the new turbine rule as it finalizes also looks like it will be really influenced by that hydrogen availability question and the like. And then the last question was asked about how compliance is really actually executed through the EPA regulations. Is another major venue where this work really could help. Again, the EPA program is created as a cooperative fairness program. The EPA creates the standard. The states execute it. As long as the states do something that's environmentally equivalent, the state, they should have a plan that would be approvable by EPA. So thinking about how maybe the states will find some more creative ways to find compliance. Going forward, I think again, EPA's ability to revisit and just as a technology enforcing statute is key, and really curious about sort of what happens if those tax credits from the IRA get extended and they may smooth out that investment pattern. Last thing I want to say, just because I have the microphone and it's opportunities, I think it's a good opportunity, Jackson, for us to advertise the event that we are having on February 28th at Duke University at the Fuqua School of Business. Nicholas Institute and Fuqua School are co-hosting an event on the IRA and how it motivates investment, can motivate investment by private capital in climate solutions and the energy transition. We have speakers coming right now, expecting from the government, John Podesta and Jigar Shah to come, CEOs from major firms and private equity firms and VC leaders coming to the campus to really explore that topic. And I think it's a good way to accentuate that actually motivating private capital is really what gets the investment to the level we need to address this climate solution. And I think I just hit it at 11 o'clock.
Thanks much, Tim. Masterful wrap up. That just leaves me to thank Tim and Martin and all of our participants for your time and for your insights over the last 2 hours. We're proud of this piece of work, and we also view it as a starting point for much more to come, including some modeling that we'll do over the course of the year on the future of electrification, alongside a number of more qualitative policy briefs that will be released and convened around by Energy Pathways USA. Please keep an eye out for more to come. Thank you again. We'll sign off now. All the best.